All right. We are live. Cool. We did it. We are a touch late, but that's okay. Cory, welcome. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Amanda, thank you so much for having me. And everything's happening in perfect time. I'm so happy that we've gone live right when we just did.
Yeah, absolutely. Things always happen as they're supposed to. And, just based on what we're wearing right now, I think it's pretty apparent that we're in very different climates. Tell me where you're tuning in from today.
I'm in Caraíva, Brazil. I'm actually at my Pilates studio. It's not mine, it's the Pilates studio that I go to. My teacher, Leo, I promised him that I would never be late for class again. So I'm doing you can see here, there's the studio, but I'm at Pilates. I'm in Brazil. I haven't worn a shirt since we last spoke, and I don't plan on wearing one anytime soon.
Amazing. You are the same type of Canadian as me. I wear a shirt because I'm a woman and that's, politically correct and that sort of thing. But I prefer to be in climates where, I don't have to be in sweatpants and a sweater as I am today. And so I'd be curious to know, like, what are things like in Brazil? Because I know we chatted last in March, kind of right as everything was going down. We had a great talk about the legal side of, having an online yoga business, and things have changed a lot over the last couple months. How are things where you are?
Things have changed a lot. How are things where I am? It's sort of I don't want to say a loaded question, but it's a complex question. So I'll answer directly. And the caveat is that I don't read the news.
Mm-hmm.
So I understand that things, obviously, that there are a lot of changes going on in the world, and that it's a difficult time. But I've chosen not to read the news, and around me, I've only seen examples of abundance and beautiful things. So we live in a beach town. You have to cross a river to get here. They've stopped letting people cross a while ago for weeks. And my understanding from what I've heard is that Brazil is getting worse and worse and worse. For the town that we live in, thankfully, there are 0 cases. I don't believe there's ever going to be a case. So things are different in the sense that almost all the businesses are closed. But as I'm sure everyone around the world is experiencing, that whatever used to be so foreign now becomes normal. And now it's normal to live in a touristic beach town without any tourists and with everything being shut. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm just focusing on the beautiful and wonderful things around me, like the sun and palm trees and the river, and that's what I'm focusing on. So things are wonderful.
Amazing. Thanks for sharing that. And I love, that attitude and perspective on things. And it's interesting because I live in a tourist town in Alberta, just outside of Banff National Park. As you may or may not know, the national parks in Canada just opened about a week ago, June 1st. And over the last couple of weeks, we've started seeing more influx of more local tourism. Obviously, Canada is still closed to non-essential travel, non-residents, and non-citizens. But we're seeing a lot of people start to make their way out and about in the world, which is in my opinion, as long as it's, people feel safe to do so, I think it's great to see people kind of like coming out a little bit. It's like the bears are out from hibernation and the humans are out as well.
I'm happy to hear you say out and about. That struck a Canadian sentimentality chord with me, to remember that. Like, yeah, we do say out and about.
Yeah, but not ootin' and a boot though. That is not something we say in the West.
No. Cool.
You will not catch me saying oot and a boot. That is not going to happen. And so, one of the things we're going to focus on today is talking a little bit about the legal side of things and, what it kind of looks like as we reopen. And everyone across the globe is at a different phase with this. I know that the hotspots are kind of moving around a little bit with the virus. And I think for some people, the idea of reopening feels very far off, maybe very scary. But, for a lot of people, especially in Canada and the US, we're starting to have those conversations about what it looks like as yoga studio owners, as yoga teachers to start teaching back in person. And there's a lot of stuff we need to consider. I mean, I manage a studio here in town in Canmore, Alberta, and every week the management team's having conversations about what it looks like. And there's a lot of things to think about logistically, strategically, technologically, but there's also this legal side. So I'd love to hear just kind of, from the perspective of a lawyer, what are some of the things that you've been, talking with clients about and considering when it comes to this reopening?
There's a lot to unpack with what you've shared. And I think the most important, the big picture perspective to keep from all of this is that there's not really a script. And even wherever we are today, where we'll be in 2 weeks from now, we don't really know what's going to happen. And we've never really been operating our businesses in that way before, right? Like before, it sort of seemed like things were normal. Numbers go up, numbers would go down. Is someone a contractor or an employee? Like those were sort of the things that we were constantly thinking about. But even now, as we look to something like reopening, the question, like working with clients to come up with, PR policies and prepare for having to close after reopen, is like, that's the 3 steps ahead of something that we're looking at. So what I'll say during this period is that it's been really, really interesting, because you see how different people approach their business differently, which is not something new, but in sort of extreme circumstances, it's fascinating to observe that certain things are more important to other people, i.e. some people, the most important thing is opening as soon as possible, and maybe being first to market in your particular location to open, even if that means, circumventing rules or not having everything in place beforehand because you believe that's what's most important, versus others who are deciding to stay closed longer until there's more certainty or a clearer path about what it is that they want to be doing and how they want to do it. What I will say generally is that most of what how our business operates as lawyers is that we will be, again, because there's no COVID laws, and there aren't new pieces of legislation that could possibly be passed quickly enough to inform us of how things should happen. We're learning mostly from our clients' experiences. So our clients will connect with us and say like, hey, I had a question about this. Like, so just as an example, something that right before I hopped on this call, I got an email from a client saying, can I put something in my waiver of liability saying that anyone who decides to wear a mask is doing so at their own risk, and that we're not responsible for any complications that comes from them practicing hot yoga with a mask on, right? So I'm sure you can appreciate, like, I don't technically have an answer. Of course, we can put something like that in, but it's just an example. What I'm trying to illustrate is that every single day, every single email, the services that we provide and how we provide it are changing. So it's really, really important to sort of be observant. And I'm happy to share a couple of the really important themes or things that I've seen be most important or most effective for studios. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I'd love to dive into that. And just before we get there, I just wanted to comment quick that I think what you said is totally on point, because it is very much like, I don't like, nobody has a script for this. Nobody has a rule book for this. So much of this has been like, okay, we're adapting as we go. And that's certainly had its challenges in general as businesses, but certainly from the legal perspective, it's like, okay, last time we talked a lot about like, oh, you need to make sure your waivers are up to date and that your insurance covers you for this. And we go into this like sort of survival mode in times of crisis. And then it's like, we kind of need to pull back from that and make sure that we're kind of, after we've got our stuff up and running, that we're actually doing it correctly. And that's certainly been my experience as somebody that works with yoga studios specifically, is like, okay, we did the thing and now let's make sure we've got everything else in place. And I think one of the conversations we've been having, or that I've been having with these studios, is hopefully we can be a little bit more, what's the word? Like a little bit more not
Proactive.
like, yeah, proactive with this. And especially, here with the Alberta government, we know kind of what phase we're in. We don't know exactly when that's going to be, but we've got some sense of it. So we know like kind of what the rules are going to be like. We've watched other businesses open in the community. We've kind of seen what they've done. So we can kind of pull bits and pieces to kind of make informed decisions about how we're going to reopen. And, that certainly doesn't mean we have all the answers, but it feels like we've got a little bit more time on this side of things versus the other side, where it was like, everything's closed. WHO's declared a pandemic. Okay, we got to run a business, like tomorrow we got to be online. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I think it's what really has emerged is a great opportunity. I think as much as it seems like it's a state of complete lack of control and everything's happening without you being able to sort of manipulate what's happening, I actually see the opposite with a lot of my clients. So what I think what I've been coaching my clients to do as best as possible is to really take a step back, and it's the best opportunity to honestly look at your business in the eye and see, okay, what are the services that we provide? how do we provide these services? Where do we provide these services? What's the compensation related to these services? And really coming back to the basics of thinking of how you operate your business. And as you know, my whole approach to law is communicating expectations openly and honestly. So, and the idea is that when you have a document or an agreement where both parties are being like fully transparent about what their expectations are within something, and when you're able to document that and both people sign it or on the same page, then it's like the relationship has gone to a new level. So I think what I've seen happening in a really encouraging way is a lot of people, maybe before they didn't have great studio membership agreements, or they weren't really. There are a couple things that are like, oh, we should probably fix this, but we're not going to. And what my encouragement to everyone has been during this time is like, design the relationships that you want. Like, you've sort of been given a carte blanche here to begin again and, go back to the drawing board and reevaluate, okay, how much is rent and how much are we getting from online and whatever other questions that you can be considering, and like reverse engineer the relationships and the business to be exactly what you want. And that's something that I've seen that's come as a real positive from this whole experience, from this uncertainty of not knowing. I agree with you. There was that moment where it was like, oh my God, in 48 hours, we have to be streaming and we have to get media releases and we have to do all of these things and update our waivers. But in the calm that's followed, and then again, you're right. So different governments are on path for what they should be doing, or, so you have an expectation. But in the same line, like as a team, if I was having a team with, if I was the owner and talking with my studio managers and my staff, I'd be like, what have you guys learned from this? How do you feel the community is responding? What do they need? How can we achieve this within the parameters of what we're allowed to do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Those are great conversations to be having. And I love what you're talking about assessing like what's working, what's not, and taking some of this time to make sure that you've got all that stuff, because we have essentially, as yoga studios, closed our physical doors, and some are not online, a lot are, and being able to kind of reassess what it looks like to reopen from all different perspectives, I think is really important. I'd love to dive into like the legal essentials, like
Yeah,
this is really not my forte, my area of
cool.
expertise, as you know from our last conversation. So I'd love to know, like, what are some of the essential things that we need to be looking out for as we approach reopening and as we start reopening our doors?
So legally, what I would say the most important thing to follow would be whatever your jurisdictional rules are related to opening, following those rules, and not only following those rules, but going out of your way to show that you have made a very, very strong attempt to become aware of those rules, and that you've done everything in your power to follow those rules. So the question would be why? Why does it matter that you're doing that? At law, there's something that's called negligence. And negligence basically means when you screwed something up because you weren't careful enough.
Mm-hmm.
And again, because legislation is not able to pass, new laws about waivers of liability for COVID or whatever, I'm taking a very, very practical approach to this all. And I just think, from my perspective, if I was hired by someone, a complainant, who went to a yoga studio and got injured or allegedly contracted COVID at that particular studio, what are the things that I would look at, and what are the pinch points that I would try to, make a claim against that studio? And I think and that's sort of like the reverse perspective to wrap your mind around, like, okay, and that informs you about, okay, what can I be doing to be at best practices? And I think the biggest area for exposure is going to be not following the rules. So that if let's say you open up and hopefully you've had enough time to open up and to become informed, if you don't, let's say there's a very, very strict rule in your jurisdiction that says you are only allowed 6 people for a non-essential service. 6 is the number, right? It's on the municipal website. That information is out there. And then you have 7 people in your class. And if something happens in that class with 7 people, like, just how obvious is that? If there were rules, you didn't follow the rules, and because you didn't follow the rules, someone has gotten injured or hurt or has contracted a communicable disease, and as such, you're clearly negligent. And that's just like all of the other things that you can have in place if you're not following the basic rules at this particular point, and those are the rules of opening. That, like, the most simple and basic step that anyone can follow is get informed about what the rules are and make sure you follow those rules. And two
Mhm.
practice points that I've shared with a lot of my clients have been, one, if you're a studio owner, make sure that you have a staff meeting with all of your team. Record the meeting on Zoom or on StreamYard, because StreamYard is awesome.
Yeah. StreamYard, you
Had
want to sponsor this episode of the
No,
podcast?
just had to give that shameless plug. I don't know why. I just like this. I like that we're using this. So
Yeah.
record the meeting on Zoom and read the rules aloud to everyone on the team, and just say to everyone, like, hey guys, we're opening up in Canmore. Maybe, this is what the municipal government has said is permissible. Certain distance of 5 meters between people, maximum of 6 people in a particular space. Opening hours are only between X and Y. And then keep a recording of that, because that is an example. If someone's going to allege that you were negligent, that's like that's a really good counter argument to negligence. Like, hey, not only did we know the rules, but we shared them with all of our team, and we have proof that we shared them. And I think in addition to that, another thing that you can do is post the rules publicly in that particular place in your studio, and just post them so that everyone's aware. It's super clear. Like, hey, these are the rules, and we're doing everything that we can to follow the rules. And I think, like, any conversation about legal, abidance to times of uncertainty, step one is following the rules.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I think that that's a really important one, and knowing kind of what the rules are in your area. It's interesting because we just got in the town of Canmore with the studio here, we just got permission to run outdoor classes. That's something that's been, that the areas here have said that's fine as long as you follow the rules. But despite the fact that the Alberta government has said that you can have 50 people in a space as long as they're the 6 feet or 2 meters apart, the town has actually set a max of 25. So we have to make sure that everyone's pre-registered. We can't have walk-ins. We can't have, 24 people is fine, 26 is not. And so it's kind of giving us a little taste for exactly what you're talking about, where, I mean, we could get like, I don't actually know what the penalty is for having 26, but I would assume that they could at least take away the permissions for us to do outdoor classes. And that puts us in, a not great position if somebody does get sick or does get hurt or something like that. So it's kind of this new, I guess, territory to explore in, because previously I think the only, I guess, thing we've really needed to think about as a studio is making sure that we've got, capacity for like our insurance that covers like fires and exiting the building safely in case there's an emergency. And that looks very different than the keeping 2 meters apart and, max of this amount, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and I think it's not even, it could be the issue of losing a business license or getting a fine for breaking the rule or whatever it is, but also just like don't be that business. Don't be the one that just didn't follow the rules because you were incapable of following the rules, because who knows if they're going to try to make an example of businesses like that. And it's just, these are the rules. Like, in the most basic sense, the law is following the rules. And I think this is just heightened and magnified in this particular time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Just quick before we dive into the next thing, we've got a couple people saying hi. I can just bring these up. Hi, Rachel. And then this person says, hi, Amanda and Cory. Thanks for having this discussion today. No worries. Thanks so much for being here. If you guys have any questions, you can put them in the chat and I'll see them show up, and we're happy to tackle anything that you have to ask. Or I guess Cory's happy to tackle anything that you have to ask. I probably don't have an answer.
I feel like we're a good team, Amanda. So we're happy to answer together.
Yeah, for sure. I think we've got this covered between the two of us. Okay, so moving along with the essentials that we need to know. So following whatever your government is saying, I think, is really important, and specifically looking, within your country, and then, your province or state, and then your specific municipality.
Yeah, those are the basics. And like, I think everyone who's listening to this will understand, like, we can put a check mark beside that. We can make ourselves aware of the rules, and we can be sure to follow those rules. The next thing the next issues that have been coming up, and I can just I can share a bunch of them, and you can let me know if you have a preference to dive into any of them. One has been like the importance of updating employment and contractor agreements as a result of everything that's happened, specifically to include voluntary return to work provisions and releases of liability related to COVID. That's one issue. Scope of services agreements have been really changed a lot in the past month and 2 months as a result of the chargebacks to credit cards. So what we saw happening a lot was, again, every studio or every business will have a particular, will take a stance, and some will be like, put it on pause for 3 months now, no charge. And other people say, hey, we had this agreement and we offered you an annual membership at a particular price, so you have to honor those payments. And then what people are doing is they're saying, oh, my studio is no longer able to offer the services, please cancel my credit card payments. And people are terminating their agreements and getting chargebacks outside of what the written agreement they had was. And I think that those are like those two issues, coupled with like the necessity to update a waiver of liability as well, are really particular. Or do any of those speak to you more than others that you'd like me to address first? Or
Yeah, I'm actually really curious about the first one you mentioned with the contracts and stuff with teachers, because I think that this is a really important one. And this is something, I mean, this is something I've kind of thought about, is like, nobody asked for this situation yet. I think that as an employer, it's important to ask if your employee or your contractor is okay with, the current conditions. And, at some point businesses are going to get the okay from the government to go back, but does that necessarily mean that the business is ready to go back? And even more so, does that mean that, the contractors or the employees are comfortable with that? So I'd love to kind of hear like what that looks like on the legal side and what we need to prep for as, teachers and studios.
okay, I'm going to answer that. And then also, if I forget, please remind me to speak about non-compete clauses.
Okay.
Just because that's something that we've seen a lot of in working with clients. Okay, so the issue is that now, okay, let's say the government of Alberta is saying that we can open our studio back up, or we can practice in parks, or we can practice outdoors, and there can be 25 people. But do our staff members want to return to work, and do they feel comfortable to return to work? And what happens if they don't feel comfortable to returning to work? And what are we allowed to do? And I think the first, like, to just take a little bit of a step back, one of the biggest trends I've seen is that studios that often just had contractors are now shifting to employees, because you can exert more control over the way the services are provided by an employee, as opposed to a contractor who runs their own business, who technically at law, you are not allowed to control the way the services are being performed. So what I see business owners doing is shifting more to, maybe they used to have 12 contractors and now they have 6 employees, but within those 6, they're allowed to ask them to do more things and be more specific and about what they're specifically doing. So the next issue is, okay, either we have contractors or we have employees, and what if they don't want to come back? Like any aspect of how everything that we've spoken about, all of it comes down to the relationships and the relationships that you want to have and how you communicate to those relationships. So what do you do in the event of, let's say your studio manager is someone who's been with you for a long time, but says, I don't feel safe or comfortable. My parent, I have a parent who's at risk and I want to continue to see them, so I don't want to be going into a public space. Like, very, very probable, very realistic. How do you deal with that? It's an individual choice. There's not an answer about your moral compass, about what you think is right and what sets an example for the rest of the team. But what I can say is as follows, is that one, anyone who is returning should be signing a document, or should be signing either an addendum to an employment agreement or a contractor agreement, which explicitly states they are voluntarily returning of their own volition. And the reason why you want that in writing and acknowledged is because the situation you want to avoid is that, unfortunately, there's a bad consequence down the road, and someone may try to say they were coerced or they felt pressure to come back, that they might lose their job. You want something that, in a very isolated, clear sense, says that people are returning on their own volition. And you're also going to want a release, the same way that waivers of liability have been updated to include COVID-related issues. You're going to want your staff to sign something that says that if in the event that they contract, COVID while in the workplace, that they're not holding you responsible, that they understood this risk before they came back to work, and that they continue to work with full understanding of that risk, knowing that the studio would be operating at best practices to ensure, the studio would do everything possible to keep them as safe as possible. And those, again, these are examples of things that there's no statute that is mandating that this be done. But just for me as a lawyer of working with so many clients in this space, it's just a foreseeable issue that someone would be upset. And if something goes wrong, these are the different things that they're going to claim. So we want business owners to be prepared and to have that documentation in place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. That makes so much sense to me. And I think that, just like asking teachers if they are comfortable, coming to a studio to teach online, or if they need to stay at home for whatever reason, I think that making sure that you are having a conversation with your teachers about if they're comfortable to come back to the studio when you can open is really important. And then, also, I think just understanding that there's still a risk of people getting sick. Like the virus is still going around. It seems like it's going to be around for a while, if not forever. And, of course, we're going to build up immunity to it just like we have other viruses. Maybe I shouldn't say, of course, I'm certainly not an expert in virology. I should just throw that out there. But yeah, I think there's a lot of good stuff to consider there for sure in terms
And
of how we interact with our staff.
It all comes to the relationship. And I think the biggest challenge is, I think one of the biggest challenges is like, how do we approach the situation where we have a great staff member who doesn't want to come back, but we still need to fill bodies? So then are we bringing someone in the short term and then letting that person go when the other person's ready? And, what example does it set to the team if we're allowing one person to stay at home? And you know what, as trite as it might seem, the businesses that I've seen do the best during this period are the ones who communicate the most openly and the most honestly with the culture comes from the top down. So as a business owner, it really comes to you to let everyone know what your expectations are and why those are your expectations, and act accordingly. But that being said, for me being a lawyer for all of these business owners, I won't let them not have those documents signed, just because it's too obvious. It's such low-hanging fruit that if something were to happen, God forbid, like you want the appropriate documentation in place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. And you mentioned non-compete clauses. What do we need to know about that?
Non-compete clauses they're so fascinating because they range from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And whenever there's a confusing area of law, I always try to get people to come back to the policy of it. And the policy is like, what was the rationale that lawmakers had in mind when they were coming up with a certain law? And when it comes to non-compete, the idea is that you should have the confidence if you are opening a business and you are training someone about your business and how it operates, and giving them all of the insight about how you operate, and you've taken all of the chance in doing it. The government wants you to be protected so that that person cannot, come work with you for 4 months, see how everything works, and then go off and down the street, open the exact same business based on the expertise that you shared with them. And I think part of it has to do with like being careful of who we bring on our teams and, being mindful of that, but also knowing that the government to some degree does want to look out for us and protect the individual endeavor and protect people from someone coming and taking their business. That being said, where non-competes have really, really come up in our industry has been as follows. Before, if you wanted to teach yoga, you had to do so at the local studio. So if I live in Canmore and I go to Community and I grab a brownie, there we go. I was waiting for that smile.
I went to Community the other day. You can't sit inside yet, but they've got some tables outside. So
yeah, you did. Yeah, you went to Community. Community is a great spot in Canmore.
My husband used to work there.
Really? I was there once when I went to Banff Yoga Festival, and I was just like, Community is the greatest place I've been.
I know. She needs to open more of them because it is so good. And it's normally so busy on the weekends. Like we don't even go on the weekends because it's lined up out the door. And for good reason. It's delicious.
Yeah. She definitely has a turmeric latte. I'm just fantasizing now.
Yeah. Everything is good there. Everything's good there. Their menu's really limited right now just because, of the virus and stuff, and making sure that they can keep everything safe and sanitary, and probably with stocks of food, which is something I don't know anything about. But I'm excited for their menu to expand again and I can eat all my favorite things.
Okay, cool. I'm with you. And just a big shout out to Community. And if I'm speaking to someone from Canmore, you can't not talk about Community. So that's why I had to. But to come back on track. So the way that it used to work was as follows. So I teach in Canmore, and that's really Canmore. I don't know how many yoga studios there are. There probably can't be more than 3.
There's 3 right now. Yeah, that's right.
3. Okay. So there's 3 studios in Canmore, but whatever. I go, my access to having a clientele and earning money as a yoga teacher is traditionally came from the studio. So the studio sort of held the power about, okay, you know what the schedule looks like and how many hours you get and what slot you're in and this, that, or the other. And then what happens as a result of COVID and everyone being shut down is that like suddenly everyone's phone becomes their own yoga studio. And if I used to go to an awesome studio in Canmore because my favorite teacher was there, but now like during this 2 or 3 month period, I've just followed that teacher on their Instagram live and I'm practicing with them every day. Now, like, why would I pay the studio if I could just practice with that particular teacher one-on-one or whatever it is? And I think so just to pause from the non-compete, I think again this is forcing studio owners to go back to the drawing board and like, what brings people through the doors? Why does this matter? How can we build strong community? Understanding that now there are competing forces that may have not been there before. But in the non-compete issue, what I've seen a lot of, and as I said, a lot of studio owners making the transition from contractors to employees is like wanting to put in super strict non-compete clauses into these agreements. And for them, part of the non-compete and non-solicitation clauses and all these things that try to prevent your teachers from starting their own business. And it's so fascinating for me because as much as the law wants to protect the business owner, the law also makes an effort to protect the individual and their ability to earn an income based on their profession. And to what point, and again, to add to this ambiguity, there aren't laws that are like, there's not like the Instagram yoga stream law that says, if someone's streaming from their Instagram, that doesn't count as non-solicitation with their employment agreement. Does this make sense?
Yeah, no, it definitely does.
And I just share it because it's something that so many studio owners, I see them trying to put in stricter and stricter non-compete clauses because they sort of have that feeling where before it was like the yoga teacher would do anything to be on the studio schedule. And during this period, it's shifted where I think there's more power now with the yoga teacher. And the yoga teacher's like, oh, like, why would I not just take my own clients and again, take my Instagram live or maybe start a studio online and to, teach from a park, and what's stopping me from starting my own business? And it's just interesting as a lawyer to see the contractual intervention of that and the attempt to use agreements to curb that transition. Whereas my practice point would be and always is to manage the relationships and speak to the people on your team. And like, if before you're signing someone to an employment agreement on your team, this is a big issue for you and you don't get clarity in your relationship about what is right to do or what is wrong to do, if you don't have that at the start, I mean, you'll be running into an issue 6 weeks into the relationship at the latest. And then it's a stress, and then it's a distraction, and then it's like COVID plus dealing with the staff. So I think that sort of the practice point that I want to come to with people is like, and it starts with the studio owner first, like get clear on your policies. Is it cool for our teachers to be also teaching on their own channels? And are they allowed to work with clients from our studio one-on-one? How do we feel about that? And sort of once you are able to communicate what's important to you, then you can share that with your team and also maybe even make it a dialogue so that everyone's on the same page.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. And I think that I really like to come at things from like an abundance mindset where we're not like making actions out of like, I guess, fear or like lack mindset. And I think that sometimes if the business or the studio owner's reaction is like, oh, well, my teachers are teaching outside the studio, I need to get them on non-competes. To me, that feels like coming from a little bit of like fear-based or like lack mindset, as opposed to, okay, well, like the studio offers something great, and here's how I can make sure that the students and the teachers feel supported, as opposed to just like, oh, well, let me lock them into this contract so they can't do anything on their own. I don't really love that personally.
No, neither do I. And like, even just think about those words, locking someone into a contract.
Right. It feels like so awful.
How long will that last? It's not a long-term solution. And ideally, and I agree with you. The question is, okay, it's awesome that, like now the studio having this particular teacher has more value. Like now that this teacher has, has built their following and is doing better online, that's more leverage for the studio to promote them. So maybe we put something in like, okay, cool, continue to teach your classes as you like, but if you're an employee, we would ask you to promote the business every 6 posts or every 3 stories or something like that. And like the cool thing about law that I think people don't appreciate is that you can create anything that you want. So the exercise always is reverse engineering it and thinking about what the desired outcome is, i.e. having a great relationship with teachers who are able to engage with the community more, and how do we have an agreement that communicates that?
Yeah, absolutely. We have a question here that I'll just bring up. Oh, cool. So it's Shannon. Thanks, Shannon, for being here. She says, our main insurance company here in Ontario, maybe Canada, Lackner and McLennan, I think that they're all across Canada, told me that we need to all follow the regulations set by our government, but that they still won't offer a lot of guidance with regards to COVID-19. I would love to hear your thoughts on this. They said that it needs to be assessed by each individual claim. That makes me want to wait to teach in person.
Hey, Shannon. Okay, to answer that question to the best of my ability, our law firm has a partnership with an insurance company that's called Be Yogi. And we had a really, really interesting call with them where they basically had said, my understanding is that communicable diseases are not covered under the policy, which makes sense. So what I would say to you is if you're hesitant to teach, and like, look, if an insurance company is outright coming out and telling you that, hey, we don't have a uniform policy around this, that doesn't give me a lot of confidence. And what I would say is if you're in a position where if you're building your practice and continuing to work either in person or online, I would make sure that I have really strong legal agreements. Because to me, legal agreements and insurance they're sort of like 2 safety nets that are built upon each other. So if an insurance company is saying that they're unwilling to, insure you and that it comes down to a case by case basis, firstly, like very, very ambiguous and obviously super non-committal, because they don't want to have anything in writing which says that they would cover you in the event of something related to a communicable disease. I would say that if you return, I would make sure to have really, really strong legal documents that cover you in that event. I hope that helps, Shannon.
Yeah, Shannon, if you're still here and watching, if you have any follow-up questions with that, just put them in the chat and we can definitely talk about them. I think, it is a little bit complicated because it is something that we've never really navigated before. And, of course, insurance companies are probably going to play it a little bit safe. Something I'm curious about, Cory, that I was thinking about when you mentioned liability and waivers before is so previously it was really, and still it's really important for, somebody who's entering the yoga space to a student to say, I recognize that I'm entering into this physical practice and I could hurt myself. Now that there's this virus that's at risk, should we be adding something that's like, I understand that by practicing in person, I could contract coronavirus?
Yes, 100%. There's 200%. Again, in absence, and sorry if I just keep repeating the same thing, I think as lawyers, we're just trained to provide a caveat for everything we say. So normally the answer used to be it depends, but now my new version of it depends is because there's no coronavirus law. You just, again, think about a situation where you're exposed to risk. So before it was they're coming into the studio and they're practicing with us. What are the activities? What are the risks? What are the outcome of those risks? Are they healthy enough to participate? Are they voluntarily participating, understanding everything that we're doing together? And then only after that can they release us of liability. The second phase of that was practicing online. So if you remember, I said the biggest challenges to a waiver of liability will always be that the activities were not specific enough and that the risks were not specific enough. Someone practicing yoga online is a different activity from someone practicing yoga in the studio. They could be using their own props. The cat can be running around in the living room. They could be they could be doing a pose, in with terrible form. And because you've got 6 other people on the Zoom call, you don't have the opportunity to observe them and correct them. So the second wave had to do with, okay, updating it for online. So now, okay, you're practicing online. You're going to be unsupervised. Do not use any props that the teacher's not using. You do not push your limits. I'm sure you can imagine all the things of how you'd update it. Now that we've opened back up to cope, now we're opening back up, and now people are in a space where, hypothetically, I don't know anything. Hypothetically, it is possible that someone at your studio is positive and can share that disease with them. Now the activities are different and the risks are different, because now the activity is that you're practicing yoga in a physical space where there's the possibility of contracting a communicable disease. And the risk is different, because the risk is that you can contract that disease and then, fall prey to the dangers of that disease and whatever can happen as a result of it. So there's totally been a third wave of the waiver regeneration, which has had to do with just people explicitly stating, like, by entering this physical space, I understand that there's a risk I will contract COVID-19, and as a result of that, I release you of liability. I understand what can happen if I have COVID-19, and I'm still choosing to voluntarily participate, as well as affirming their own health to say, like, I've not traveled in 14 days, and I haven't been to the zone, or I whatever, all of the things to say that they're not showing any symptoms themselves, and that they're healthy enough to participate. So it's directly there. And I think even the necessity has sort of been increased or heightened due to the sort of the insurance industry being so mum on what they will support for claims and what they won't.
Right. And so, a question for you. Does this need to be in a waiver that people sign, or is like having signs in this space good enough?
100% should be signed or electronically agreed to.
Right.
So it's we at Conscious Counsel, we call it a waiver tune-up. And anyone who was a client of ours and bought a waiver of liability from us, we offered free tune-ups to them to make sure that they're covered. But it's the reason why you want it signed is waiver of liabilities are different than everything else, because it's the one document where people are signing away their legal rights. And they're saying that I forfeit my legal rights to bring an action against you. And as such, it's just like the bar is that much higher that you want that signed. You want to be, God forbid, not even in court, but even in the negotiation phase, I want to have a photocopy of that document that I'm sending to an opposing lawyer and say, hey, I'm really sorry, your claim is defeated because you forfeited your legal right to bring an action. I'm like, that's the point of having legal documents at this particular juncture, that you can stop any conversation about your exposure to liability, because you can prove, like, this is what happened. We told you about this before. You still decided to participate and come to our studio. And as a result, like, our prayers are with you. We love you. We want you to be better, but we told you about this beforehand.
Right. Yeah. I guess I was thinking logistically in terms of like reopening a studio, like for the studio here, for example, we have a lot of members that have been members for many, many years at this point. I mean, they signed their waivers so long ago, right? And one of the things we're also trying to do once we can reopen is have everyone sign online so that people don't have to be touching and sharing a pen. So just thinking about, how we can make sure that they understand the risks of coming back into the studio and release ourselves from being legally held responsible if somebody does get sick and they think it's from the studio, but then also not, making it a big pain in the butt for somebody who's been a longtime member where they're like, I don't want to sign this document. I already did this ages ago. Do you know what I mean?
I know what you mean. And like, that just comes, and what that comes down to is, how are you communicating this change to your community? That's what it comes down to. And when you let them know that you are only able to open your doors if everyone signs a new document, everyone will sign a new document if they care about your studio and they care about you. And it's just like, it's more and more. And I'll give you an example. So another thing that we saw a big issue with was media releases. So studios, what happened is studios were recording teachers, but they wouldn't have a specific agreement in place that said, hey, we own the intellectual property and we may repurpose this for an on-demand library or for an online course down the road or whatever it's going to be. So like only at because again, everyone was like, overnight, now we're an online studio. So because everyone did that online, they had to, go back and get people to sign afterwards. And this is like, these are my honest observations. As much as you think this is about law, it's not really about law. 50% of the clients had zero issues whatsoever getting their staff to sign the agreements because they communicated in a particular way. And what they said was, as not verbatim, but I can tell you the spirit of what they said was, we're trying really, really hard to continue to pay you during this pandemic. And the way that we're able to do that is by, putting streaming the classes and recording them and selling them to members. And as a result of us doing that, because we're investing in you and we're continuing to pay you during this uncertain time, we need you to acknowledge that we own the intellectual property, and this is an investment that we are making by paying you for it. Does that, could you be on board with that based on what I've just said?
Yeah, for sure. And actually, after we chatted back in March, this was something that I brought to the attention of the studio owners that I work with. And, that was a conversation that did happen here between the studio owner and the teachers. Like, if you're uncomfortable with the idea of us recording your content, that's fine. Just let us know. We don't have to record the content, and we just let them know exactly what's happening with the videos. And it was essentially like, in order for our members who are continuing to pay the same price that they did when we were in studio to feel valued, we want them to have access to the classes at any point. And the teachers were like, yeah, I mean, if they're paying the same, we get paid the same. We're cool with that. And once they understood kind of what was happening with it and how they could potentially use that content, like once that conversation was opened, I felt like it was very clearly understood and it was very easy to get the teachers on board.
That's it. And then the other half, then I just got a bunch of emails from clients who were like, none of my teachers want to sign this. They're all up in arms about it. And I'm just like, firstly, my job is to draft a great agreement for you to use, not to teach you how to implement it. But secondly, it's like, how are you explaining this to people? And even Amanda, just using your own words, the issue that you posed was, how do I get, my members to re-sign the waiver of liability? You just have to provide the same value proposition to them, where it's like, you love practicing yoga with us. We want to keep our doors open. In order for us to do that, we're asking you to either electronically or, print this at home and bring us a signed copy or whatever it is. And who's going to say no if they care about your studio and they want to participate? So
yeah, I think too, if they want to practice yoga, which I think at this point, from what I'm hearing, yoga's been a very, very important part of emotionally and mentally processing this pandemic. And, it seems like from the response that I've gotten from students is that they're very grateful for this service. And I think that if it was presented in the fact, in order for us to safely open back up, to keep you guys safe, to keep us safe, we need you to sign this document. If we made it really easy for them, I don't see the members having a big issue with that.
And they won't. And also, if someone doesn't want to sign it, it's your business and your livelihood at risk because they haven't signed the agreement. So what's it worth to you?
Right. Exactly. Yeah, that's a good point. Shannon just wrote a little follow-up. I'll just read quick. She said, good to know that B Yogi is on the same page with this. Brackets, if I'm understanding this correctly, for now I'm teaching virtually because I can. So yeah, I think that definitely makes sense. If you're not getting clarity on, kind of the insurance side and the legal side of teaching in person, it seems to make sense to stay virtually if you can. Obviously, there's situations where that makes it more complicated if you're not teaching online or you can't because of the way you run your business or something like that. But it seems like for this particular situation, that makes sense. And yeah, B Yogi's awesome. I'm a partner with B Yogi. I think they're great. Definitely recommend them for my American listeners.
Yes.
You have anything to add to that, Cory?
No, I think it's the most important thing at this point is everyone's confident in the services that they're offering. And if you're going to have doubts about offering in person because you're unsure of, how that relates to insurance, just do whatever you're comfortable with during this time. There are enough challenging circumstances outside of that it's best to find peace with whatever it is that you are offering.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I completely agree. I'm curious if there are any other legal essentials, legal tips that we need to know about as we head into this sort of next phase of the pandemic.
The only thing that I would want to share or talk about is the service agreement. So a service agreement, it generally is if you're providing a service for someone, you have them sign an agreement. It can be called a studio membership agreement. It could be called a one-on-one teaching agreement. There's a lot of different names for it. But just like as a really sort of simple hack, what I've discovered, and I never really used the word hack. Feels like very techie, doesn't he? Like, oh, I'm
A
inventing
little
a
bit.
hack.
It also
Not
feels very kind of like unlegal because I feel like in a lot of ways the law is like this is right, this is wrong, and hack feels like, oh, am I like hacking the legal system?
hack. I think shortcut's a better word for hack, but just again, just because it's been for me, it's been such a special journey these past months, going through different phases of just like seeing all of my clients dealing with the same issues, and just like the first time it happened, I was like, whoa, this is crazy. And then the eighth time, I'm like, okay, this is really easy. I have a shortcut. Wink, wink. You thought I was going to say hack. I wasn't going to. I have a shortcut for how to deal with this. So just a really, really simple one is in your service agreement, there's a couple of things. Again, when the issue is that people are registering chargebacks. So they've agreed to a certain payment plan, or they've agreed to a certain amount of money, and now they just basically decide out of nowhere, like, oh, it's COVID, I have no more money, and now I'm not paying for this, even though we had a signed agreement that had particular provisions about what I could or couldn't do. And the important thing, a really, really important thing, and all of this has to do with consumer protection law, is that basically, and it has to do with no refunds and cancellations and all of that stuff. And the way that a lot of service agreements were drafted, they were drafted around the sense that, excuse me, the service that you were providing was teaching in yoga instruction in the studio. So if the studio was closed, then therefore you are unable to provide your part of the services. Under consumer protection laws, you are not allowed to charge me for a recurring payment of a service that you cannot provide. Therefore, I'm automatically allowed a refund. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for
So
sure.
a really, really simple shortcut that of what we've done has been, it's been tightening up, the use of incremental pay or auto payment descriptions in a particular agreement, and talking about how the relationship will operate between the provider and whoever's using the particular service, to sort of put safeguards in to protect you and your business, so that you're not at the whim of a credit card company granting all of these chargebacks in a very short period of time. But even more so, it's just like, it's changing the scope of the services of what you offer to either be yoga in person, or be yoga online, or be both.
Mm-hmm.
And in that event, let's say you open back up, and okay, you open back up a month down the line, all, your studio numbers are back, the revenue's flowing again, everything's awesome. And then God forbid, for some reason, you have to close down the next, something happens, you have to close down. You're going to want your service agreement to explicitly state that you will fulfill your end of the services when either by providing services online or in person. So in that event, if you have to shut down the studio, no one is then allowed to say, oh, well, I pay you for being a yoga studio and you're not able, right? So then you're like, well, we're still able to provide the services. Therefore, you're not protected under consumer protection laws. Therefore, you're not allowed to cancel your payment, and you will not be granted a chargeback. So I think that that's just like one final thing. If people are curious, like, how can working with a lawyer make my life easier? Or, how can investing in a document and paying, $600 up front for a document, how can that pay dividends in the long run? It's like something as simple as changing the scope of services so that people are not, they do not have the case against you in regards to consumer protection acts. And as such, you get to retain all of your monthly revenues from your members.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I did a really great episode on insurance. It went out, I guess, last week if you're watching live. And, we talked a lot about why you need insurance or why you should have insurance. And a lot of it's for in case something happens. And I feel like too, when we talk about this legal side of things, I think it's like having good documents, having good policies, making sure that your agreements are signed, making sure your ducks are in a row is like, in case something happens, because maybe $600 seems like a lot to invest up front, but if somebody sues you, I mean, $600 is not going to be a lot.
Not just so you know, the process of going through this, all of it stinks. It's super expensive. People cry a lot. And it's just not fun. And I think I try really, really hard as a lawyer to coach like being proactive with documents and understanding that it is a small investment up front, but the peace of mind and the protection that it provides you afterwards, it's like even just going through the negotiations before you get sued will cost at least $2,000. So just, investing up front makes so much sense. And yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, we have one more question. Do you have time for me to read it?
Yeah, let's do it. Leo's already warming up the machines in there. He's got a big smile. He's a lovely man. But we can
Okay,
do it.
we'll talk
For
about this
Facebook
and then
users, we can do it.
I'll let you go. It says, what about the teachers who are sharing a community space, libraries, churches, etc., in terms of how things are cleaned? I can't imagine needing to clean the way we do at our PT office at a shared space. Is there something legal we need to do when we rent space? That's a
What
great
I would
question.
say for that, I would speak to the landlord or whoever's allowing you to use that space, and I would get really clear on what their policies are and ask them what they have in place if they're opening and they're renting it out to you, because ultimately it's their responsibility to make sure that everyone who uses the space is treating it in a proper way. So what you want to have is the confidence of knowing that that particular space is clean enough, and that it shouldn't be your job to be concerned or worried, but certainly your landlord should have policies and rules in place. And again, like something as simple and basic as posting them and printing them and putting them up, like just having those rules of how the space should be cleaned. Because ultimately what would happen is, depending on the agreement that you have with your landlord or whoever the space provider is, in the event that you're facilitating a class there and someone contracts the virus and you did what they told you, you would then bring, this is how much law can suck, but you would then bring a legal action against them for their negligence of making sure the space wasn't safe enough. But again,
Right.
all of that can be mitigated by having the proper legal agreements, and so that whoever is practicing with you understands, like that's an example. Whoever's practicing with you understands it's a common space and that you're going to try your best, but it may happen that someone doesn't clean it properly, and just they accept that risk when they practice with you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And this is a really great thing to be considering and talking about, because, we're living in like a different world than we were back in November, December. And we need to be considering, where people have been, how they're feeling, if they're sick, how we're cleaning our spaces, and all this type of stuff. So I think the overall takeaway I'm having is to have really clear legal documents, make sure that we're really making sure that they are legally sound, have the right stuff, and just making sure that everyone who's involved is very clear on, what's happening, make sure they're all in agreement and that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's respect. I really see the documents as being a form of respect, where you let people know exactly what they're getting into and then they get to decide. And and when there's respect in relationships, it's a lot easier for things to run smoothly.
Yeah, absolutely. Amazing. Well, I'm seeing people get ready for class over there, so that's my cue to let you go.
Pilates class. I'm gonna go backstage now. I'll just head backstage to the Pilates studio. But this was really wonderful. Thank you for the opportunity to chat, and reach out if you need anything. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to write me. I'm here to support.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Cory. And where can people go to find you if they do need to get in contact, if they want to learn more about your offerings, learn more about the legal side of yoga? Where can they go for that?
We have a website, which is yogalegal.com, and on Instagram we're at Conscious Counsel. And I also wrote a book that's called The Yoga Law Book, Legal Essentials for Yoga Professionals, which is on Amazon. I'm sure we'll be able to send you a whole bunch of links and you can put that stuff out there.
Yeah, that would be awesome. Thank you so much for your time today. Enjoy your Pilates class. Soak in some sunshine for me.
Have a good snack at community for me when you go. And I'll tell the Pilates crew that you say what's up.
Okay, sounds great. Thanks so much, Cory. And thanks for everyone who tuned in.
Thank you.
Ciao.